My name is Diane Miller, and I spent 6 hours sitting in that fluorescent-lit Social Security office waiting for my children to pick me up, watching them ignore my calls while I had no way home. What they didn't know was that the monthly checks they thought I desperately needed were actually just pocket change compared to the stock portfolio I'd been quietly building for 30 years. The same children who rolled their eyes when I asked for rides, who sighed when I needed help with groceries, who treated me like a burden they inherited, rather than the mother who sacrificed everything for them. They thought I was just another broke senior citizen clinging to government assistance. They had no idea that while they were arguing over who would eventually get my worthless belongings, I was sitting on enough wealth to change all their lives forever. But after that day at the Social Security office, after being forgotten like an old piece of furniture, I decided they'd never see a penny of it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. People think abandonment happens in dramatic moments, like in movies where someone drives away in the rain or slams a door and never comes back. But real abandonment is quieter. It's your daughter saying she'll pick you up at 2 and showing up at 6 without an apology. It's your son acting like helping his mother is the greatest inconvenience of his week. It's sitting in a government office for hours, watching other families hug and laugh together, while your phone stays silent and your children treat you like an obligation they wish they could delegate to someone else. I raised 3 children in a small ranch house in Millfield, Kansas, and I thought I did everything right. I packed their lunches every morning, drove them to soccer practice and piano lessons, helped with homework until my eyes burned, and worked double shifts at the local diner just to afford the things they needed. When my husband Carl died in Tatinea, a car accident 12 years ago, I could have crumbled. Instead, I held our family together with duct tape and determination. I worked harder, saved smarter, and made sure my kids never felt like they were missing out on anything just because their father was gone. Marcus, my oldest, is 34 now and works in insurance in Topeka. He's always been the practical one, the one who inherited his father's serious nature and my stubborn streak. He calls me every other Sunday, usually while he's driving somewhere, and our conversations follow the same script. How's your health, Mom? Are you keeping up with your medications? Do you need anything from the store? Efficient, dutiful, but hollow. Like he's checking items off a list rather than talking to the woman who taught him how to tie his shoes and read bedtime stories until her voice went hoarse. Then there's Jennifer, 32, my only daughter and the one I thought would understand me best. She lives about 40 minutes away in Prairie Ridge with her husband Derek and my 2 grandchildren, Emma and Tyler. Jennifer inherited my creativity and my tendency to worry about everything, but somewhere along the way, she also picked up this habit of treating me like I'm fragile and clueless. She talks to me the way you'd talk to a child who doesn't understand why they can't have ice cream for breakfast. Sweet but condescending, patient but exasperated. And finally, there's David, my baby at 29. He moved to Kansas City right after college and works in marketing for some tech company I've never fully understood. David was always my free spirit, the one who made me laugh when the other 2 were being too serious. But success changed him, made him busy and important, and too sophisticated for his small-town mother. When he visits, which isn't often, he spends most of his time on his phone dealing with work emergencies that seem to require his immediate attention every 5 minutes. After Carl died, I made a decision that my children know nothing about. I took the life insurance money, which wasn't huge but wasn't nothing either, and instead of paying off the house or going on some grief vacation like people suggested, I opened an investment account. I started small, learning everything I could about stocks and bonds and mutual funds. I read books from the library, watched financial shows on public television, and slowly, carefully, began building something for my future. The woman at the investment firm, Patricia Henley, probably thought I was just another widow trying to make her husband's life insurance last as long as possible. She was kind but kept things simple, probably assuming I wouldn't understand the more complex strategies. What she didn't realize was that I had a mind for numbers and patterns. I'd been managing our family's tight budget for years, stretching every dollar until it screamed, and I knew how to spot value and make smart choices with limited resources. I started with blue-chip stocks, companies I understood and trusted. Coca-Cola, Johnson & Johnson, companies that made products I used every day. Then I branched out into technology, buying Apple when everyone thought they were just a computer company, getting into Amazon when people said online shopping would never replace real stores. I reinvested every dividend, never touched the principal, and watched my little nest egg grow month by month, year by year. But I never told my children about any of this. Not because I was trying to hide anything, but because I wanted them to love me for who I was, not what I might leave them someday. I watched too many families get torn apart by money, saw too many children suddenly become attentive when they learned about an inheritance. I wanted my kids' affection to be genuine, not motivated by dollar signs. So I kept living modestly. I stayed in the same small house, drove the same 10-year-old Honda Civic, shopped with coupons, and never spent money on anything that seemed extravagant. To my children, I looked like exactly what they expected. A widowed mother living on Social Security and whatever small savings their father had left behind. They worried about me financially, but in that distant way that people worry about problems they don't want to deal with personally. The Social Security checks I received every month were real, but they weren't necessary. They went straight into my checking account to cover basic expenses, while my investment account grew quietly in the background. Some months, my stock dividends alone were more than my Social Security payment, but my children never asked about my finances in detail. They just assumed I was getting by, barely, and occasionally one of them would slip me a 20 or offer to help with groceries, gestures that felt more like charity than love. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself they were just busy, with their own lives, their own families, their own struggles. Young people today had more pressure, more expenses, more demands on their time than my generation ever did. They weren't being selfish or ungrateful. They were just overwhelmed. At least that's what I kept telling myself every time I felt lonely. Every time I wished one of them would call just to chat. Every time I realized days had passed without hearing from any of them unless they needed something. My daily routine was simple and predictable. I woke up at 6 every morning, made coffee in the same blue mug Carl gave me for our 10th anniversary, and sat on the back porch watching the sunrise over the wheat fields that stretched beyond my backyard. I'd read the newspaper cover to cover, check my investment portfolio on the laptop Jennifer had bought me for Christmas 2 years ago, and then figure out how to fill the hours until bedtime. Mondays I went to the grocery store, carefully using coupons and buying store brands even though I could afford to shop anywhere I wanted. Tuesdays I volunteered at the library, helping elderly patrons with computer classes and reading to children during story time. Wednesdays I went to my book club at the community center, where 6 other women my age gathered to discuss whatever novel we'd chosen that month and catch up on town gossip. Thursdays I cleaned house, did laundry, and paid bills. Fridays I ran errands and sometimes treated myself to lunch at the diner where I used to work. Weekends were for yard work, church on Sunday, and hoping one of my children might call or visit. It wasn't a bad life, just a quiet one. I had my health, my independence, and the security of knowing I'd never be a financial burden on anyone. But there was an emptiness that no amount of money could fill. A loneliness that crept in during the silent hours when I realized that despite raising 3 children and investing 30 years of my life in building a family, I was essentially alone. The signs of their growing indifference were subtle at first. Phone calls became shorter and less frequent. Visits stretched from every few weeks to once a month to special occasions only. When I suggested family dinners or holiday gatherings, there were always scheduling conflicts, prior commitments, or last-minute emergencies that prevented them from coming. I found myself making elaborate meals for one, setting the table with, my good china, and then eating alone while the other three place settings sat empty and accusing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I started keeping a small notebook where I tracked when each of them called or visited. Not because I wanted to keep score, but because the days blended together, and I sometimes couldn't remember if I'd heard from them recently, or if it just felt recent because I thought about them constantly. The entries became shorter and further apart. Marcus called, asked about my blood pressure, said he had to go. Jennifer stopped by for 10 minutes to drop off Emma's old clothes for me to donate. David texted happy birthday 2 days late, but I made excuses for them because that's what mothers do. Marcus was working long hours trying to make partner at his firm. Jennifer was overwhelmed juggling her part-time job with raising 2 active kids. David was building his career and probably dating, though he never mentioned anyone special. They weren't intentionally neglecting me. They were just caught up in their own lives. At least that's what I told myself during the long evenings when the phone never rang and the house felt too big and too quiet. The worst part wasn't the loneliness itself, but the way they made me feel like I was asking for too much whenever I needed anything. A ride to the doctor when my car was in the shop became a major inconvenience, requiring 3 phone calls and a lecture about how I should consider moving closer to town. Asking for help, moving a heavy box, or reaching something on a high shelf was met with sighs and comments about how I really should think about hiring someone to help with these things. I stopped asking for help with anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. I learned to manage on my own, to solve problems without bothering them, to be the low-maintenance mother who never caused trouble or demanded attention. But the more independent I became, the more distant they grew, as if my self-sufficiency gave them permission to care even less. The irony wasn't lost on me. While they worried about my finances and occasionally made comments about seniors on fixed incomes, I was quietly accumulating wealth that would have shocked them. My portfolio had grown to well over $800,000, and in a good month, my dividend payments exceeded what most people in Millfield earned in a week. I could have bought a new car, renovated the house, taken cruises, or moved to a fancy retirement community. Instead, I lived like someone who was always one emergency away from poverty, partly out of habit, and partly because I was testing something I didn't want to admit even to myself. I was testing whether my children loved me for who I was, or whether they were just waiting for me to become enough of a burden that they'd have to pay attention. I was testing whether their concern for my welfare was genuine, or just the guilty obligation of adult children who knew they should care more than they did. And month by month, year by year, I was getting my answer, and it wasn't the one I'd hoped for. The Social Security office visit that changed everything started with something that should have been simple. I needed to update my direct deposit information because I was switching banks, trying to get a better interest rate on my checking account. It was a routine piece of paperwork that required an in-person visit because of new security protocols, and I couldn't drive myself because my car was in the shop getting the transmission repaired. I called Marcus first because he was the most reliable, the one who usually said yes when I needed help, even if he acted like it was an imposition. But his phone went straight to voicemail, and when he called back 3 hours later, he was already in meetings that would run until evening. He suggested I call Jennifer or David, or maybe reschedule for a day when he could take time off work, as if updating bank information was something I could put off indefinitely. Jennifer was my second call, and she answered on the first ring, which gave me hope. But before I could even finish explaining what I needed, she was already making that noise she makes when she's overwhelmed, that little sigh that sounds like air leaking out of a balloon. She had Emma's dance recital rehearsal, Tyler's soccer practice, a conference call with her boss, and Derek was working late, so she was handling everything alone. Could I possibly take a taxi or ask one of my neighbors? Surely someone from church could give me a ride. The suggestion that I should impose on neighbors or church friends rather than ask my own daughter for help stung more than I expected. These were people I barely knew outside of Sunday services, casual acquaintances who were polite and friendly, but not the kind of friends you call for favors. But Jennifer made it sound like asking her for a 40-minute round trip was unreasonable, while asking virtual strangers was perfectly logical. David didn't answer his phone at all. I left a voicemail explaining the situation and asking if he could possibly drive down from Kansas City to help me out, knowing it was a long shot but hoping that maybe, just maybe, he'd surprise me. He texted back 6 hours later. Super busy. This week, Mom? Can Marcus or Jennifer help out? If not, maybe next week? I stared at that text for a long time, reading it over and over, feeling something crack inside my chest. Super busy. Maybe next week. As if my time and my needs were infinitely flexible. As if I had nothing better to do than wait around for their schedules to align with my life. That's when I made a decision that surprised even me. I called Jennifer back and told her I'd found a ride, that she didn't need to worry about it. Then I called a taxi company and scheduled a pickup for the next morning. $28 each way, which was more than I usually spent on groceries in a week, but I had $800,000 sitting in investment accounts, so I could afford a $56 taxi ride to handle my own business. The taxi driver was a kind older man named Roy who told me about his grandchildren during the drive and treated me like a person rather than a burden. He offered to wait for me at the Social Security office, but I told him I'd call another cab when I was finished, not knowing that this simple errand would turn into an all-day ordeal that would change my relationship with my children forever. The Social Security office was busy that morning, packed with people who looked as tired and frustrated as I felt. I took a number and settled into one of those uncomfortable plastic chairs to wait my turn. The number board showed they were currently serving number 47, and my ticket said 93. This was going to take a while. I called Jennifer to let her know I'd arrived safely, and that it looked like I'd be here for several hours. She seemed relieved that I wasn't asking for anything, just updating her on my status like a responsible adult should. I told her I'd call when I was ready to head home, thinking I'd take another taxi rather than bother her again. But she surprised me by saying she might be able to pick me up later, after Emma's rehearsal finished around 4. It was a small kindness, but it felt huge after the struggle just to get here. By noon, they'd only reached number 68, and I was getting hungry. The office had vending machines, but I'd packed a sandwich and a bottle of water, habits. From my diner days when you learned to take care of yourself because nobody else would, I ate quietly in my chair, watching other families navigate their Social Security business together. Adult children helping elderly parents fill out forms, translating bureaucratic language, advocating when things got complicated. I felt invisible and forgotten, but I told myself it was fine. I was independent. I could handle this alone. At 1:30, they called number 93, and I finally got to see a caseworker. She was a harried woman named Mrs. Peterson who seemed genuinely sympathetic but overworked and rushed. The bank change should have been simple, but there was a problem with my new account number, and she needed additional documentation I didn't have with me. Could I come back tomorrow with my new bank statements and a letter from the bank confirming the account details? I explained that I'd taken a taxi to get here, that it had already cost me $56 just for transportation, and that coming back tomorrow would be difficult. Mrs. Peterson looked genuinely sorry but said there was nothing she could do without the proper paperwork. Government regulations, security protocols, identity verification. She gave me a list of exactly what I needed to bring and promised it would be quick once I had everything. I called Jennifer from the lobby, explaining the situation and asking if she could still pick me up. She answered on the 4th ring, and I could hear kids screaming in the background. Emma's rehearsal had run long. Tyler was having a meltdown about something, and Derek had just called to say he'd be even later than expected. Could I take another taxi? She'd pay me back, she promised, but she just couldn't get away right now. I told her not to worry about it, that I'd figure something out. But when I called the taxi company, they said it would be at least an hour. Wait, because all their drivers were busy. I could wait outside, or I could call back later and try again. The Social Security office was closing at 4:30, and I didn't want to sit in the parking lot for an hour in the heat. So I went back inside and settled in for another wait, this time with nowhere to go and no clear plan for getting home. I called Marcus and got voicemail again. I called David and got the same. I sent text messages explaining that I was stranded and needed help, but my phone stayed silent. By 4 o'clock, the office was nearly empty, and I was one of the last people sitting in the waiting area. The security guard kept looking at me like he was wondering if I had somewhere to go. I called Jennifer again and got voicemail. I called Marcus and got voicemail. I called David and got a text back. In important meeting, we'll call later. Important meeting. At 4 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. More important than his mother being stranded with no way home. That's when it hit me. Sitting in that fluorescent-lit government office surrounded by empty chairs and the echoes of my own unanswered phone calls. This wasn't just a scheduling conflict or a particularly busy day. This was how my children saw me, as someone whose problems were always less important than whatever else they had going on. Someone who should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention they could spare. Someone whose needs could always wait until it was more convenient for them. I sat there until 5:30, long after the office had closed, waiting in the lobby because I had nowhere else to go. Finally, Jennifer called back, sounding frazzled and guilty. She was so sorry. She'd completely lost track of time. The kids had been impossible. Derek still wasn't home. Could she pick me up now? She'd be there in 45 minutes. When she finally arrived, I was sitting on a bench outside the building, watching the parking lot empty as the last government workers headed home to their families. She pulled up with her windows down and Emma in the back seat, looking flustered and apologetic but also slightly annoyed, as if my needing help had somehow disrupted her day more than it should have. The ride home was awkward and tense. Jennifer kept apologizing and explaining how crazy her day had been, but there was an undercurrent of resentment, like she was doing me this enormous favor, and I should be more grateful. Emma chattered about her dance recital from the back seat, oblivious to the tension between her mother and grandmother, and I smiled and asked the right questions while my heart broke a little more with each mile. When we pulled into my driveway, Jennifer didn't turn off the car. She gave me a quick hug and said she'd call me later, but we both knew she wouldn't. I thanked her for the ride, told Emma to break a leg at her recital, and walked into my empty house alone. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, staring at my investment portfolio. $837,000 and growing. More money than my children could probably imagine, more than enough to make all their lives easier and more comfortable. And they had no idea it existed because they'd never bothered to ask detailed questions about my finances, never wondered how I managed to live so comfortably on what they assumed was a fixed income. But more than that, they'd never asked because they didn't really want to know. Caring about my financial situation would mean taking responsibility for it, and it was easier to assume I was getting by than to dig deeper and discover I might need help. Or worse, that I might not need them at all. I closed the laptop and made myself a cup of tea, the same ritual I'd followed every night for 12 years since Carl died. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the end of something and the beginning of something else, though I couldn't yet see what that might be. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I knew exactly what I needed to do, and it had nothing to do with Social Security paperwork or bank account changes. It had everything to do with the woman I used to be before. I became so focused on being the mother my children needed that I forgot to be the person I wanted to be. For 30 years, I'd been building wealth in secret, preparing for a future I never allowed myself to enjoy. I'd been living like someone who couldn't afford better while sitting on enough money to transform my entire life. I'd been waiting for my children to love me enough to prioritize my needs, to see me as more than just a problem to be managed or an obligation to be fulfilled. But I was done waiting. I was done being the convenient mother who never asked for too much, who solved her own problems, who made herself small so her children could feel big. I was done pretending that $56 taxi rides were a hardship when I earned more in dividend payments each month than most people made in salary. I was 71 years old, and I had enough money to live any kind of life I wanted. I had enough money to travel the world, to live in luxury, to never worry about anything ever again. And I had enough money to make very sure that my children understood exactly what they'd lost when they decided their mother's needs would always come last. But first, I had some paperwork to take care of. And this time, I wasn't taking a taxi. The morning after the Social Security office incident, I did something I hadn't done in 15 years. I called in sick to my volunteer shift at the library. Not because I was physically ill, but because I needed time to think, to process what had happened, and to figure out why a simple request for help had left me feeling so hollow and disposable. I sat in my kitchen with my second cup of coffee, staring out at the backyard where Carl used to grow tomatoes every summer. The garden had been dormant for years now, just an empty patch of earth that I mowed over because I didn't have the energy to maintain it. But this morning, for the first time in a long time, I found myself wondering what it would look like if I planted something there again. Not tomatoes, maybe. Something just for me. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer around 10:30. "Hope you got everything sorted out yesterday. Sorry things were so crazy. Talk soon." 3 exclamation points and a heart emoji, as if punctuation could make up for leaving me stranded for hours. I stared at the message for a long time before typing back a simple, "Yes, all good." I didn't add any exclamation points. The thing about being forgotten is that it doesn't happen all at once. It's a gradual erosion, like water wearing away stone. Yesterday wasn't the first time my children had treated my needs as secondary to their convenience. It was just the most obvious, the most undeniable example of a pattern I'd been trying not to see for years. I opened my laptop and logged into my investment account, a ritual that had become as routine as checking the weather. The numbers glowed, back at me in neat columns: stock prices, dividend yields, total portfolio value. $842,000 as of this morning's market close. The number had been climbing steadily for years, but I realized I'd stopped feeling excited about it some time ago. What good was financial security if you had no one to share it with? What was the point of building wealth if the people you loved most saw you as a burden rather than a blessing? But as I scrolled through my holdings, something shifted in my perspective. This wasn't just money sitting in an account. This was freedom. This was choices. This was the ability to live life on my own terms instead of waiting for other people to decide when and how they'd fit me into their schedules. I'd spent so many years being careful, being frugal, being the mother who never asked for too much. I'd worn the same clothes until they were threadbare, driven the same car until the repairs cost more than payments on a new one, lived in the same house with the same furniture for decades because I thought that's what responsible people did. But what if being responsible didn't have to mean being invisible? The mailman knocked around 11, which was unusual. Usually he just left everything in the box by the road. But today, he had a certified letter that required my signature. Something from Patterson, Cole & Associates, which sounded like a law firm but wasn't familiar to me. I signed for it and waited until he drove away before opening it. Inside was a letter from an attorney named Robert Patterson, informing me that my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who lived 3 houses down, had passed away suddenly of a heart attack the previous week. I'd noticed I hadn't seen her walking her little terrier lately, but I'd assumed she was just staying inside because of the heat. The letter explained that Mrs. Chen had named me as the executor of her estate, a responsibility I never knew she'd assigned to me. I sat down hard in my kitchen chair, the letter trembling in my hands. Mrs. Chen and I weren't particularly close friends, just neighbors who waved when we saw each other and occasionally chatted about the weather or the new shopping center they were building on the outskirts of town. But apparently, she'd trusted me enough to handle her final affairs, which struck me as both an honor and a tragedy. How sad that an elderly woman had felt more confident in a casual neighbor than in whatever family she might have had. The letter included a phone number for Mr. Patterson and a request that I call at my earliest convenience to discuss the details. I set it aside for the moment, overwhelmed by the idea of taking on such a significant responsibility, but also touched that someone had seen me as dependable and trustworthy enough for such an important task. Around noon, Marcus called, which surprised me because he usually only called on Sundays. "Hey, Mom, just checking in. Jennifer mentioned you had some kind of errand yesterday that took forever. Everything okay with your Social Security?" The casual way he asked, like my 6-hour ordeal was just some kind of errand, irritated me more than it should have. "Everything's fine," I said. "Just needed to update my banking information. Took longer than expected." Good. You know, if you ever need help with that kind of stuff, you should just ask. We don't want you dealing with government bureaucracy alone." The irony was so thick I almost laughed. "I did ask," I said quietly. "I called you first, actually, and Jennifer, and David." There was a pause, and I could practically hear him searching for the right response. "Oh, right. Yeah, yesterday. Was just crazy at work. Big client presentation. But next time, give me more notice and I'll make sure to clear my schedule." More notice. As if needing to update bank information was something I could schedule weeks in advance like a vacation. As if my time was infinitely flexible while his was carved in stone. "I'll keep that in mind," I said, though we both knew I wouldn't be calling him for help anytime soon. After we hung up, I realized that was the most frustrating part of all of this. It wasn't that my children were cruel or intentionally neglectful. They weren't villains in some family drama. They were just thoughtless. They'd gotten so comfortable with me being the self-sufficient mother who handled everything alone that they'd stopped considering I might actually need them sometimes. And when I did need them, it felt like an inconvenience rather than an opportunity to show they cared. I spent the afternoon cleaning house, which had always been my way of thinking through problems. As I dusted picture frames and organized closets, I found myself really looking at the photos scattered throughout my home. Pictures of Marcus graduating college, Jennifer's wedding, David accepting some award at work, pictures of my grandchildren, at various ages, gap-toothed grins and soccer uniforms and birthday parties. But I realized there were very few recent pictures of all of us together. The last family photo I could find was from Christmas 3 years ago, and even then, everyone looked like they'd rather be somewhere else. When had I become the obligation instead of the destination? When had visiting me become something my children endured rather than enjoyed? I tried to pinpoint the exact moment when our relationships had shifted from mutual affection to one-sided maintenance, but it had happened so gradually that there was no single incident to blame. Evening came early that day, or maybe I was just tired of fighting off the melancholy that had settled over me like a heavy blanket. I made myself a simple dinner of soup and crackers, ate it while reading a mystery novel, and went to bed earlier than usual. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay in the dark, listening to the house settle around me, thinking about Mrs. Chen dying alone and trusting a neighbor to handle her final affairs because she had no one closer to turn to. Was that my future? Would I spend my remaining years becoming gradually more invisible to my own children until some neighbor had to notify them that I was gone? Would they attend my funeral with the same distracted efficiency they brought to helping me with errands, checking their phones during the service and rushing back to their important lives as soon as the reception ended? The next morning, I called Mr. Patterson to discuss Mrs. Chen's estate. His office was in downtown Millfield, in one of those old brick buildings that had been converted into professional suites. He was younger than I'd expected, probably around David's age, with kind eyes and a patient manner that suggested he'd dealt with confused executors before. Mrs. Chen's estate was more complex than I'd anticipated. She owned her house outright, had several savings accounts, and a small investment portfolio managed by a firm in Topeka. She also had a sister in California who would inherit everything, but who couldn't travel to Kansas to handle the details, due to her own health problems. My job would be to coordinate with appraisers, real estate agents, and financial institutions to settle everything and transfer the assets to the sister. "It's quite a responsibility," Mr. Patterson said. "But Mrs. Chen specifically requested you in her will. She wrote a note saying you were the most trustworthy person she knew in Millfield. That's quite a compliment." Driving home from his office, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and purpose. Sadness for Mrs. Chen, who'd died alone without her, children nearby, but purpose in knowing that someone had trusted me with something important. Someone had seen me as capable and reliable, even if my own family seemed to have forgotten those qualities. I spent the next week diving into Mrs. Chen's affairs, learning more about her life than I'd ever known while she was alive. She'd been a retired school administrator, had never married, and had poured her energy into her garden and her volunteer work at the animal shelter. Her house was immaculate, filled with beautiful furniture and carefully tended plants. She had photo albums full of pictures from trips to Europe and Asia, adventures she'd taken alone because she'd never found anyone who shared her wanderlust. As I sorted through her belongings and organized her papers, I found myself envying her independence. She'd lived exactly the life she wanted, traveled where she pleased, decorated her home to suit her own tastes. She'd never had to negotiate with anyone about what to watch on television or where to go for dinner. She'd never had to worry about being a burden on children who saw her needs as inconveniences. But she'd also died alone, and that fact haunted me as I worked my way through her possessions. Was independence worth the loneliness? Was it better to live authentically alone than to live smaller in the shadow of people who didn't really see you? During this same week, my own children's behavior became impossible to ignore. Marcus called his usual Sunday call, but when I tried to tell him about Mrs. Chen and my responsibilities as executor, he cut me short. "That sounds like a lot of work, Mom. Are you sure you want to take that on? Maybe you should find someone else to handle it." The suggestion that I should abandon a responsibility I'd accepted, a trust that had been placed in me by someone who'd seen me as dependable, stung more than he probably intended. "I gave my word," I said simply. "I just think you should be careful about getting in over your head. Legal stuff can be complicated and you don't want to make mistakes that could get you in trouble." His concern felt more like condescension than care, as if I were a child who might break something important if left unsupervised. "I'm managing fine," I said, though I could hear the coolness in my own voice. Jennifer's response was even worse. When I mentioned Mrs. Chen's death during one of our brief phone conversations, she immediately launched into worry mode. "Oh my God, Mom, you shouldn't be dealing with dead people's stuff. That's so morbid and depressing. Can't you just say no? You're supposed to be enjoying your retirement, not taking on more work." The fact that she saw helping a deceased neighbor as morbid rather than compassionate told me everything I needed to know about how differently we viewed responsibility and community. "It's not work," I tried to explain. "It's helping someone who trusted me." "But why did she ask you? You barely knew her." "It's just weird, Mom. I think you should get out of it." I realized in that moment that my children had no idea who I really was. They saw me as someone who should be content with a small, quiet life, someone who shouldn't take on challenges or responsibilities beyond the basics of existing. They'd reduced me to their idea of what a 71-year-old widow should be: careful, limited, grateful for whatever scraps of attention they could spare. David's reaction was the most telling of all. When I reached him by phone and explained the situation, he was distracted and impatient. "Look, Mom, I really can't talk. Right now." I'm in the middle of something important. But maybe you should think about whether you really want to get involved in legal stuff. It sounds complicated, and you're not exactly a lawyer. Not exactly a lawyer. As if intelligence and competence were qualities that expired with age, as if decades of managing a household and raising children and building a secret investment portfolio had taught me nothing about handling complex situations. After I hung up, I sat in my car in the parking lot of the grocery store and felt something crystallize inside me. My children didn't just see me as an obligation. They saw me as incompetent. They'd gotten so used to thinking of me as someone who needed help that they couldn't imagine me being the one providing help to others. They'd categorized me as a burden rather than a resource, as someone to be managed rather than someone to be consulted. And the most painful part was realizing that I'd contributed to this perception by always being so grateful for their minimal attention, so careful not to ask for too much, so determined to be the low-maintenance mother that I'd made myself seem, incapable of anything significant. That night, I called Patricia Henley, my investment advisor, for the first time in over a year. Usually I just received quarterly statements and let the professionals handle the details, but tonight I wanted to talk to someone who knew about the life I'd built in secret. "Mrs. Miller," she said, sounding genuinely pleased to hear from me. "How wonderful to hear from you. I was just looking at your portfolio this afternoon, actually. You've had quite an impressive quarter." We talked for over an hour about market trends, dividend increases, and rebalancing strategies. Patricia treated me like the intelligent investor I was, explaining complex concepts without talking down to me, asking for my input on allocation, decisions. It was the first conversation I'd had in weeks where someone spoke to me like I was competent and capable, rather than fragile and confused. "You know," she said near the end of our call, "you're one of our most successful clients in terms of long-term growth. Your instincts about reinvesting dividends and staying the course through market volatility have really paid off. You should be proud of what you've built." After we hung up, I sat in the silence of my living room and realized that I'd been living two completely different lives. In one life, I was Diane Miller, the successful investor, the woman who'd grown her modest life insurance payout into nearly $1 million through smart choices and patient discipline. In the other life, I was Mom, the aging widow who needed help opening pickle jars and couldn't be trusted with anything more complicated than basic survival. The disconnect was jarring and painful. The woman Patricia Henley knew was confident, competent, and financially sophisticated. The woman my children knew was diminished, dependent, and increasingly irrelevant to their busy lives. And I'd allowed this false version of myself to exist because I'd wanted their love to be genuine rather than motivated by money. But what I was getting wasn't love. It was dutiful maintenance from people who saw me as a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be cherished. And maintaining that fiction was costing me more than just money. It was costing me my sense of self. The following Saturday, I made a decision that surprised even me. I drove to the Ford dealership in Prairie Ridge, the one where Jennifer and Derek had bought their SUV 2 years ago. I'd been driving my 10-year-old Honda Civic so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to want something newer, something nicer, something that reflected who I actually was rather than who I was pretending to be. The salesman, a young man, named Kevin, who was probably around Marcus's age, initially treated me like most people treat elderly women car shopping, with polite condescension and an assumption that I'd need to consult my children before making any decisions. But when I started asking specific questions about engine specifications, safety ratings, and financing options, his attitude shifted. "Actually," I said, pulling out my checkbook, "I'll be paying cash." The look on his face was worth every penny of the $38,000 I spent on a brand new Ford Explorer. Leather seats, advanced navigation system, backup camera, heated everything. It was the nicest car I'd ever owned, nicer than anything Carl and I had ever been able to afford when we were raising children and watching every dollar. Driving home in my new car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Pure, uncomplicated joy. The seats hugged me perfectly. The radio was crystal clear, and everything smelled like possibility. For the first time in decades, I'd bought something just because I wanted it, not because it was practical or necessary or the most economical choice. I parked in my driveway and sat for a moment, admiring the way the afternoon sun reflected off the pristine paint. This car represented more than transportation. It represented a choice to stop hiding who I really was, to stop pretending I was less capable and less secure than I actually was. When Jennifer called that evening for her usual weekly check-in, I mentioned casually that I'd bought a new car. "You what?" she said, and I could hear the shock in her voice. "Mom, why didn't you talk to us first? Car buying is so complicated these days, and dealerships love to take advantage of seniors. What if you got ripped off?" "I didn't get ripped off," I said calmly. "I did my research, I knew what I wanted, and I got a fair price." "But how are you paying for it? Please tell me you didn't take out some terrible loan with a high interest rate. You know you should have called Derek. He's great with negotiating." Car deals. I could hear the panic in her voice, the assumption that I'd made a foolish decision that would somehow become her problem to solve. "I paid cash," I said simply. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I wondered if we'd been disconnected. Finally, Jennifer said, "You paid cash? Mom, where did you get that kind of money? Are you sure you didn't get scammed? Somehow?" It was almost funny how impossible it was for her to imagine that I might have legitimate access to that much money. "I've been saving for a long time," I said, which was technically true. "But $30,000 is a lot of money for someone on a fixed income. Are you sure you should be spending your emergency fund on a car? What if you need that money for medical expenses or home repairs?" Fixed income, emergency fund, medical expenses. She was talking to me like I was a financial invalid who'd just blown my last dollar on something frivolous. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. "I'm fine, Jennifer," I said, trying to keep the irritation out of my voice. "I know how to manage my finances." "I just think you should have talked to us first. This is exactly the kind of decision that affects the whole family. What if something happens to you and you can't make the payments?" I'd already told her I'd paid cash, but she was so locked into her assumption that I was financially fragile that she couldn't process the information. In her mind, there was no scenario where her mother could afford a new car without putting the entire family at risk. After we hung up, I realized that this was how it would always be with them. No matter what I did, no matter how clearly I demonstrated my competence and independence, they would always see me through the lens of their own expectations. I would always be the aging mother who needed protection from her own poor judgment, rather than the accomplished woman who'd been making smart decisions long before they were born. The next morning, Marcus called. Jennifer had obviously been talking to him about my car purchase, because his first words were, "Mom, we need to talk about this car situation." "What car situation?" I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. "Jennifer said you bought some expensive car without talking to anyone. She's worried you might be having some kind of financial crisis, or maybe even early signs of dementia that are affecting your judgment." Dementia. Because obviously the only possible explanation for me making an independent decision was that my mind was deteriorating. "There's nothing wrong with my judgment, Marcus. I bought a car I could afford because my old one was becoming unreliable." "But where did you get $30,000? Are you dipping into your life insurance money?" "Because that's supposed to be for emergencies, not luxury purchases." They'd been discussing my finances behind my back, making assumptions about my resources and my mental state, treating me like a problem that needed to be solved rather than a person who was capable of making her own choices. The betrayal felt deeper than their simple neglect. This was active disrespect. "I don't need to justify my purchases to anyone," I said, something I'd never said to any of my children before. I'm a grown woman who's been managing money successfully for longer than you've been alive. Mom, please don't get defensive. We're just worried about you. This kind of impulsive spending isn't like you, and we want to make sure you're not being taken advantage of by someone. Impulsive spending. As if I'd walked into a dealership on a whim and been talked into something I couldn't afford by a smooth-talking salesman. As if I hadn't been considering this purchase for months, hadn't researched every aspect of the transaction, hadn't paid cash from an account that could have covered 10 such cars. I need to go, I said, and hung up before he could respond. I spent the rest of that day working on Mrs. Chen's estate, sorting through her jewelry and coordinating with appraisers. Her possessions told the story of a woman who'd lived boldly, who'd collected beautiful things from her travels and displayed them proudly in her home. She had silk scarves from Paris, pottery from Mexico, photographs of herself standing in front, of landmarks around the world. She'd lived the life she wanted without asking permission from anyone. As I carefully packed her treasures for shipment to her sister in California, I made myself a promise. I was 71 years old, and I had more money than I could spend in my remaining years. I had health, independence, and no obligations to anyone but myself. I could live like Mrs. Chen if I chose to, boldly and authentically, without worrying about what other people thought I should do. But first, I had to stop caring whether my children approved of my choices. I had to stop being the diminished version of myself that made them comfortable and start being the accomplished woman I actually was, even if it made them uncomfortable, even if it forced them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about their mother, even if it meant they might finally see me as I really was, for better or worse. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning in October when I was least expecting it. I'd been handling Mrs. Chen's estate for nearly a month, coordinating appraisals, and managing the sale of her house, when I received a call that would shatter every remaining illusion I had about my relationship with my children. It started with David calling me at 8 in the morning, which was unusual because he rarely called before noon and never on weekdays. His voice sounded strained, almost panicked, which immediately put me on alert. "Mom, we need to talk. Can you meet us for lunch today? It's important." "All of us?" I asked, because the three of them hadn't been in the same room together since Christmas, and that was only for a few hours. "Yes, all of us. Marcus is driving down from Topeka and Jennifer's getting a babysitter. We really need to discuss some things with you." The formal tone in his voice made my stomach clench. This wasn't a spontaneous family gathering or a social lunch. This was an intervention of some kind, though I couldn't imagine what they thought needed intervening. "What kind of things?" I asked, but David was already rushing to end the call. "We'll explain everything when we see you. Can you meet us at Rosie's Diner at noon? And Mom, please don't make any major financial decisions between now and then." "Okay." He hung up before I could ask what he meant by major financial decisions, leaving me standing in my kitchen with a growing sense of dread. Something was happening, something they'd planned without including me, and the tone of David's voice suggested it wasn't going to be pleasant. I spent the morning trying to focus on Mrs. Chen's paperwork, but I kept checking the clock and wondering what crisis my children thought required such urgent family intervention. Had someone told them about my investment portfolio? Had they somehow discovered the extent of my wealth? Or was this about something else entirely? At 11:30, I drove to Rosie's Diner in my new Ford Explorer, still enjoying the smooth ride and the confidence that came with driving something reliable and beautiful. The parking lot was nearly empty, which was typical for the lunch lull between the breakfast crowd and the dinner rush. Inside, I could see my 3 children already seated in a corner booth, their heads bent together in intense conversation. They looked up when I walked in, and the expressions on their faces confirmed my worst fears. This wasn't a casual family lunch. This was an ambush. Marcus stood up first, giving me a brief hug that felt more obligatory than affectionate. "Thanks for coming, Mom. We ordered you coffee." Jennifer scooted over to make room for me in the booth, but her smile looked forced, and she kept glancing at her brothers like they'd rehearsed this interaction. David looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with his phone and avoiding direct eye contact. "So," I said, settling into the booth and trying to keep my voice light, "what's this urgent family meeting about?" Marcus, always the designated spokesperson for serious family business, cleared his throat and pulled out a manila folder. "Mom, we've been talking and we're worried about you. Really worried." "Worried about what?" "About your judgment lately. About some of the decisions you've been making." He opened the folder and pulled out what looked like printed emails and documents. "We've been doing some research, and we think you might be getting taken advantage of by people who prey on seniors." I felt my blood pressure rising, but I kept my voice calm. "What kind of research?" Jennifer leaned forward, her voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. "Mom, we know about the car. We know you paid $38,000 in cash for something you didn't need. And now David says you're involved in some kind of legal situation with a dead neighbor's estate." "Those aren't legal situations," I said slowly. "Those are normal life events that I'm handling perfectly well." "But that's just it," David said, finally looking at me directly. "You shouldn't have to handle these things alone. And the fact that you're making these big financial decisions without talking to us first suggests that maybe you're not thinking as clearly as you used to." The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. They were suggesting I was mentally incompetent, that my decision-making abilities had deteriorated to the point where I needed supervision. The betrayal was so complete and so unexpected that I actually felt dizzy. "I see," I said carefully. "And what exactly do you propose to do about this perceived problem?" Marcus pulled out more papers from his folder. "We've been talking to an elder care attorney. There are legal ways to protect you from making decisions that could hurt you financially. Ways to make sure your money is safe and that you're not being manipulated by people who might take advantage of your generosity." "You mean a conservatorship," I said, the words tasting like poison in my mouth. "It doesn't have to be that formal," Jennifer said quickly. "Maybe just having one of us help you with major financial decisions, like a safety net. We're not trying to control your life, Mom. We just want to make sure you're protected." I looked around the table at these 3 people I'd raised from babies, these adults I'd sacrificed everything for, and realized they were planning to strip me of my legal autonomy. They were so convinced of my incompetence that they'd consulted attorneys about having me declared unable to manage my own affairs. "And this was whose idea?" I asked. The 3 of them exchanged glances, and I could see the guilt and uncertainty flickering across their faces. This hadn't been a unanimous decision. Someone had initiated this intervention, had convinced the others that their mother was sliding into senility and needed to be protected from herself. "It was my idea," Marcus finally admitted. "After Jennifer told me about the car, and then David mentioned this executor thing, I started putting pieces together. The impulsive spending, taking on complicated legal responsibilities, the secretiveness about your finances. These are classic warning signs of cognitive decline." Cognitive decline. He'd diagnosed me with dementia based on the fact that I'd bought a car and agreed to help a deceased neighbor. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it weren't so devastating. "Have any of you considered the possibility that I'm making these decisions because I'm perfectly capable of making them?" I asked. "That maybe I bought a car because I wanted one and I could afford it. That maybe I agreed to be Mrs. Chen's executor because she trusted me and I wanted to help?" "Mom, please don't get defensive," Jennifer said. "We're not attacking you. We love you and we're scared. Scared that someone is going to take advantage of you. Scared that you're going to make decisions that will leave you with nothing." "Leave me with nothing," I repeated slowly. "You think I'm going to spend myself into poverty?" "We think you might not fully understand the value of money anymore," David said. $38,000 is a lot of money for someone on Social Security. If you keep spending like that, you'll run out of savings pretty quickly. There it was again. The assumption that I was living paycheck to paycheck on government benefits, that my resources were so limited that one car purchase could bankrupt me. They had no idea about my investment portfolio, no concept of my actual financial situation, because they'd never bothered to ask detailed questions about my life. "What if I told you," I said slowly, "that $38,000 represents less than 5% of my available assets?" The silence at the table was deafening. Marcus frowned like I'd spoken in a foreign language. Jennifer looked confused and skeptical. David actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "Mom, that's not possible," Marcus said. "We know what Dad left you. We know what Social Security pays. You're talking about having almost $1 million, which just isn't realistic." "Isn't it?" I asked, and for the first time since this conversation began, I felt some of my power returning. "What exactly do you think you know about my finances?" "We know enough," Jennifer said, her voice getting sharper. "We know you live in the same house, drive the same old car until now, shop with coupons, and worry about spending money on anything extra. People with money don't live like that." "Unless they choose to," I said. "Unless they're building wealth instead of displaying it. Unless they understand the difference between being rich and acting rich." I could see the wheels turning in. Their heads, the slow realization that maybe they'd made some incorrect assumptions. But instead of backing down, Marcus doubled down on his position. "Even if you have more money than we thought, that doesn't change the fact that you're making impulsive decisions without consulting anyone. The car, the executor thing, this secretiveness about your finances. These are still concerning behaviors." "Consulting anyone?" I repeated. "Why exactly do I need to consult my adult children about my personal decisions?" "Because we're family," Jennifer said, as if that explained everything. "Because major decisions affect all of us. Because you're our mother and we worry about you." I stared at her for a long moment, trying to understand the logic that made my independence a threat to them, that made my competence something to be concerned about rather than celebrated. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," I said. "You called this meeting because you're worried that I'm becoming mentally incompetent. Your evidence for this includes buying a car I could afford and helping a neighbor's family settle her estate. And your solution is to have me declared legally incapable of managing my own affairs." "We're not saying you're incompetent," David T. said quickly. "We're just saying maybe you need some help making big decisions. The same way you helped me when I was stranded at the Social Security office for 6 hours last month." That stopped the conversation cold. I could see the guilt flash across all three faces as they remembered their failure to prioritize my needs when I actually did need help. "That was different," Jennifer said weakly. "That was just a scheduling conflict." "No," I said, standing up from the booth. "That was you showing me exactly how much my needs matter to you. And now you want to control my finances because you think I can't be trusted to make my own decisions, even though you can't be trusted to give me a ride when I need one." I pulled out my wallet and put $20 on the table for my untouched coffee. "I'm going to say this once, and I want you to listen carefully. I am not mentally incompetent. I am not financially irresponsible. I am not your responsibility to manage. And if any of you tries to pursue legal action to control my affairs, you'll discover just how capable I actually am of protecting myself." Marcus started to stand up. "Mom, please sit down. Let's talk about this rationally." "Rationally?" I laughed, and it came out harder than I intended. "You ambushed me in a restaurant to discuss having me declared incompetent, and you want to talk rationally? Here's rational. I raised 3 children who apparently think so little of my intelligence and judgment that they consulted attorneys about taking away my legal rights, rather than simply asking me about my financial situation. We were trying To protect you, Jennifer said, tears starting to form in her eyes. From what? From living my life on my own terms? From making decisions you don't understand? From being independent and successful without your permission? I picked up my purse and keys, looking down at the 3 people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. You want to know about my finances? You want to understand my decision-making process? Here's a number you can research. Patricia Henley at Henley Financial Services in Topeka. She's been managing my investment portfolio for 15 years. Ask her whether I show any signs of cognitive decline or financial irresponsibility. The shock on their faces was almost comical. The existence of a financial advisor, of a managed portfolio, of a 15-year investment strategy was completely outside their understanding of who I was supposed to be. You have a financial advisor? David asked, like I'd claimed to have a personal astronaut. I have many things you don't know about, I said, because you've never bothered to ask. You've been so busy managing your assumptions about my limitations that you've never discovered my actual capabilities. I walked toward the door of the restaurant, then turned back to face them one more time. And just so we're clear, the estate I'm executing for Mrs. Chen is worth approximately $400,000. The attorney handling it considers me one of the most organized and competent executors he's worked with. Feel free to call Robert Patterson if you'd like a professional opinion on my mental acuity. I left them sitting in that booth, staring, after me with their mouths open and their intervention plans in shambles. In my new car, I sat for a moment in the parking lot, my hands shaking with adrenaline and fury. They'd tried to have me declared incompetent. My own children had been so convinced of my diminished capacity that they'd researched legal ways to control my life. But beneath the anger was something else. A strange sense of relief. The facade was finally broken. The careful pretense of being the grateful, limited mother they expected me to be was shattered beyond repair. Now they knew I had resources they hadn't imagined, capabilities they hadn't credited me with, and a life that existed independently of their narrow expectations. I drove home slowly, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. Years of making myself small so they could feel big. Years of hiding my successes so they wouldn't question their assumptions. Years of being grateful for scraps of attention. From people who thought I should be grateful just to exist in their peripheral vision. When I got home, I called Patricia Henley and scheduled an appointment for the following week. Not because I needed financial advice, but because I was ready to start making some changes to my investment strategy. Changes that would reflect the life I actually wanted to live rather than the life I thought I was supposed to want. Then I called Robert Patterson, the attorney handling Mrs. Chen's estate, and asked if he did other kinds of legal work. Estate planning, specifically. I had some documents that needed updating, some beneficiaries that needed to be reconsidered. Of course, Mrs. Miller, he said. I'd be happy to help you with that. Can I ask what's prompting the changes? I looked around my house, at the photographs of my children and grandchildren that lined every surface, at the life I'd built around their comfort and approval. I've recently gained some clarity about my priorities, I said. And I need my legal documents to reflect that clarity. The next few days passed in a strange kind of peace. None of my children called, which didn't surprise me. They were probably processing the revelation that their mother wasn't the financially fragile senior citizen they'd imagined, trying to figure out how to respond to the collapse of their intervention plans. I spent the time continuing my work on Mrs. Chen's estate, which was nearing completion. Her house had sold quickly to a young couple with small children who were delighted by the beautiful garden and the well-maintained interior. Her sister in California had been overwhelmed with gratitude for my careful handling of everything, sending long emails about how relieved she was to have someone trustworthy managing the details. I wish I could have been there to help, she'd written in her latest message. But my health just doesn't permit travel anymore. Knowing that Helen chose someone so capable and caring to handle everything has been such a comfort during this difficult time. It struck me that Mrs. Chen's sister who lived 2,000 miles away and had never met me, expressed more appreciation for my efforts than my own children had ever shown for anything I'd done for them. She saw me as capable and caring, while they saw me as a problem to be managed. On Sunday, Marcus called. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message while I watered the plants on my back porch. "Hi, Mom. It's Marcus. Look, I think we need to talk about what happened at lunch the other day. Maybe we came across wrong and I want to clear the air. Can you call me back when you get a chance?" I deleted the message without calling him back. I wasn't ready to have the conversation where they tried to minimize their betrayal, where they claimed they'd just been worried about me and hadn't meant any harm. I knew they'd been worried, but their worry had led them to research legal ways to control my life, rather than simply asking me about it. Tuesday brought a different call. This one from Jennifer. She was crying before I even said hello. "Mom, please don't be mad at us. We were just scared. When you bought that car and started doing all these new things, it seemed so out of character. We thought maybe someone was influencing you or pressuring you into making decisions you wouldn't normally make." "What you thought," I said carefully, "was that I was losing my mind." "Not losing your mind, just maybe not thinking as clearly as usual. Seniors get taken advantage of all the time, and we didn't want that to happen to you." Seniors. As if turning 71 had automatically moved me into a category of people who couldn't be trusted to make their own decisions. As if age was a form of incompetence rather than experience. "Jennifer, when you bought your house 5 years ago, did you consult me about it?" "Well, no, but that's different. Derek and I are adults with our own family." "And what am I?" There was a long pause. "You're our mother." "I'm also an adult with my own life. Being your mother doesn't make me a child who needs supervision." "But you're living alone, and we worry about you being isolated and maybe not having anyone to bounce ideas off of." I almost laughed at the irony. "You mean the way you bounced the idea of having me declared incompetent off of me before researching it with attorneys?" Another pause. "We should have talked to you first." "Yes, you should have. But more than that, you should have asked me about my life instead of making assumptions about it. You should have trusted that the woman who raised 3 children and managed a household for decades might still be capable of managing her own affairs." "We do trust you. We just wanted to protect you." "From what? From being independent? From making choices you don't understand? From having a life that doesn't revolve around your comfort and approval?" "That's not fair," Jennifer said, her voice getting defensive. "We've never asked you to revolve your life around us." But that's exactly what they'd asked for, though they'd never said it explicitly. They'd wanted me to be the convenient mother who stayed in her lane, who made small, predictable choices, who never surprised them or challenged their assumptions about what an elderly widow should be. "I need some time," I said finally. "Time to think about what kind of relationship we're going to have going forward." "What do you mean?" "I mean that something fundamental has changed. You tried to have me declared legally incompetent because I bought a car and helped a neighbor. That's not something I can just forget or forgive easily." "We would never have actually gone through with it," Jennifer said quickly. "We were just exploring options." Exploring options. As if researching ways to control my life was casual window shopping, rather than a profound betrayal of trust. After I hung up, I realized that was the most honest thing any of them had said yet. They would never have actually gone through with it, because they were fundamentally good people who loved me in their limited way. But they'd been willing to consider it, willing to research it, willing to ambush me in a restaurant to discuss it. And that willingness revealed everything I needed to know about how they really saw me. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened a bottle of wine, a good bottle that I'd been saving for a special occasion that never came, and I sat on my back porch watching the sunset. The wine was rich and complex, nothing like the cheap bottles I used to buy for cooking, and I savored every sip while I thought about the future. I was 71 years old, and I had money. Real money. Enough money to live any kind of life I wanted for whatever years I had left. I could travel the world like Mrs. Chen had done. I could buy a house on the beach or in the mountains. I could take classes, learn new skills, meet new people who saw me as I really was rather than as their diminished version of who I used to be. But first, I had some relationships to recalibrate, some expectations to shatter, some truths to reveal that would change everything my children thought they knew about their mother. The wine made me bold, made me honest, made me ready to stop pretending to be less than I was. I pulled out my phone and typed a text message. To all 3 of my children. Family meeting at my house this Saturday at 2 p.m. Non-negotiable. We need to have some conversations that are long overdue. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, then poured another glass of wine and watched the last light fade from the sky. Saturday was going to be interesting. Saturday was going to be the day they learned who their mother really was, for better or worse. And for the first time in years, I was looking forward to seeing the expressions on their faces when they realized they'd underestimated me in ways they couldn't have imagined. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that makes everything feel possible. I woke up before dawn, not because I was anxious about the family meeting I'd scheduled, but because I was energized. For the first time in years, I felt like I was about to take control of my own narrative instead of letting other people write my story for me. I spent the morning preparing my house for what would either be a reconciliation or a revelation that changed everything forever. I cleaned thoroughly, arranged fresh flowers from my garden in every room, and set out my best china on the dining room table. If this was going to be the day my children finally saw me as I really was, then I wanted the setting to reflect the woman I'd always been underneath their assumptions. At noon, I drove to the bank in my Ford Explorer, enjoying the way other drivers moved respectfully out of my way. The car commanded attention in a way my old Honda never had, and I realized that was part of what had upset my children so much. I'd stepped out of their expectations for how a 71-year-old widow should present herself to the world. Inside the bank, I requested statements for all of my accounts dating back 5 years. The young teller, a girl named Ashley who couldn't have been much older than my granddaughter Emma, was incredibly helpful and professional. She printed everything I needed without asking unnecessary questions about why I wanted such extensive documentation. "Mrs. Miller," she said as she handed me the thick folder of papers, "I hope you don't mind me saying, but you're one of our most successful account holders. My manager always points to your portfolio when she's training new staff about long-term investment strategies." I smiled at her, touched by the compliment but not surprised. "Thank you, Ashley. That's very kind of you to say. Are you planning something special? A big trip or investment?" I thought about my children sitting in their respective homes, probably dreading this afternoon's meeting, and trying to figure out how to handle their mother's supposed mental decline. "You could say that," I told Ashley. "I'm planning to make some changes that are long overdue." Back home, I spread the bank statements across my dining room table like evidence in a court case. 5 years of quarterly investment reports, dividend payments, account growth, and strategic rebalancing. The numbers told a story of careful planning, smart decisions, and disciplined execution. They told the story of a woman who understood money and knew how to make it grow. But more than that, they told the story of a woman who'd been living far below her means for no reason other than maintaining an image that made other people comfortable. Someone looking at these statements would see immediately that I could afford to live in a luxury retirement community, travel first class anywhere in the world, or buy a new car every year if I wanted to. At 1:30, I changed into my best dress, the navy blue one with the subtle silver threads that I'd bought for Jennifer's wedding but hadn't worn since. I applied makeup carefully, styled my hair, and put on the diamond earrings Carl had given me for our 20th anniversary. I wanted to look like the successful woman I was, not the diminished version of myself I'd been presenting to my children. Marcus arrived first, as I'd expected. He was always punctual to the point of being early, a trait that served him well in business, but sometimes made family gatherings feel like board meetings. He knocked on the front door instead of just walking in, which told me he was approaching this conversation carefully. "Hi, Mom," he said, giving me a brief hug. "You look nice. Special occasion?" I almost laughed at the question. You could say that. He followed me into the living room, where I'd arranged chairs in a circle rather than the usual casual seating arrangement. Everything about the setup was designed to signal that this wasn't going to be a typical family visit. "Mom, before the others get here, I want to apologize for the way we handled things last week. We should have talked to you directly instead of researching legal options first. That was wrong, and I'm sorry." It was a good apology as far as apologies went. Direct, accepting responsibility, acknowledging the specific harm. But it didn't address the underlying problem, which was that he'd been so convinced of my incompetence that legal intervention had seemed like a reasonable consideration. "I appreciate the apology, Marcus," I said, "but I think we need to talk about why you felt legal intervention was necessary in the first place." Before he could answer, Jennifer arrived with Derek and the kids in tow. I hadn't expected the grandchildren, and their presence complicated my plans for this conversation. Emma, now 14 and tall for her age, hugged me enthusiastically. Tyler, 12 and still at that awkward stage where he wasn't sure if hugging grandmothers was cool, waved from across the room. "I hope it's okay that we brought them," Jennifer said. "Derek's parents canceled at the last minute and I couldn't find another sitter." I looked at Emma and Tyler, these beautiful children who barely knew their grandmother beyond holiday visits and birthday cards, and made a decision that surprised me. Actually, I think it might be good for them to hear some of what we're going to discuss today. They're old enough to understand family dynamics. Derek raised an eyebrow, but didn't object. He'd always been diplomatic about family tensions, staying neutral when his wife complained about her mother's latest perceived eccentricity. David was the last to arrive, looking harried and checking his phone even as he walked through the door. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic was horrible coming out of Kansas City." Once everyone was settled, I remained standing while they arranged themselves in the chairs I'd set out. The physical positioning was intentional. I wanted to be in a position of authority rather than sitting among them like an equal participant in a discussion about my own competence. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "I know this week has been difficult for everyone, and I thought it was time we had some honest conversations about our family relationships." "Mom," Jennifer started, "we really are sorry about—" I held up my hand to stop her. "Please let me finish. I have some things to say and some things to show you, and I'd appreciate it if you'd let me get through everything before we start discussing it." I walked to the dining room and returned with the folder of bank statements, setting it on the coffee table where everyone could see it. "Last week, you expressed concerns about my financial judgment and my ability to make sound decisions. You suggested that I might be experiencing cognitive decline because I bought a car and agreed to help with an estate settlement." Emma perked up with interest. She'd always been the curious one, the child who asked questions about everything. "Grandma, did you really buy a new car? Can we see it?" "Yes, sweetheart, I did. And yes, you can see it after we finish talking." I looked around the room at the adults who were staring at the folder like it might explode. "But first, I think your parents need to understand something about my financial situation." I opened the folder and pulled out the most recent quarterly statement, the one that showed my total investment portfolio value as of September 30th. I held it up so everyone could see the number at the bottom, $847,183. The silence in the room was deafening. Jennifer's mouth actually fell open. Marcus blinked rapidly like he was trying to clear his vision. David leaned forward in his chair, squinting at the paper like the numbers might rearrange themselves into something more reasonable. "That's impossible," Marcus said finally. "Mom, is this some kind of mistake? Some kind of scam document?" I handed him the statement. It's from First National Bank of Topeka, Marcus, the same bank where you have your business accounts. Feel free to call them and verify. Jennifer was shaking her head slowly. I don't understand. Where did this money come from? You live like you're on a tight budget. You use coupons and shop sales and worry about spending money on anything extra. I live carefully, I corrected. There's a difference between being poor and being prudent. Derek spoke up for the first time. Mrs. Miller, this shows nearly $1 million in investment accounts. That's not Social Security and life insurance money. That's serious wealth. Yes, it is, I agreed. It's what happens when you take a modest life insurance payout and invest it wisely over 15 years, reinvesting all dividends and adding to it whenever possible. David was scrolling through his phone. Mom, even if Dad's life insurance was more than we thought, this kind of growth would require some serious financial expertise. Did someone help you with this? I worked with a financial advisor, yes. Patricia Henley at Henley Financial Services. She's been managing my portfolio since 2010, but the investment decisions and strategy have been mine. Emma, who'd been listening with the fascination that only teenagers can bring to adult drama, raised her hand like she was in school. Grandma, does this mean you're rich? Tyler elbowed his sister. You can't just ask people if they're rich. Why not? She's our grandma. I laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd had during a family gathering in years. Yes, Emma, I suppose by most definitions I am rich. Rich enough that I never have to worry about money again. And rich enough that I could help all of you in significant ways if I chose to. If you chose to? Marcus repeated slowly. What does that mean? I sat down for the first time since they'd arrived, settling into my own chair and looking at each of them in turn. It means that for 15 years, I've been watching how you treat me when you think I have nothing to offer except the burden of taking care of an aging parent. I've been testing whether your love and attention are genuine or whether they're motivated by obligation and perhaps inheritance expectations. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. I could see them processing it, trying to figure out how to respond to such a direct challenge to their motives. That's not fair, Jennifer said, her voice getting defensive. We love you for who you are, not for what you might leave us someday. Do you? I asked. Because the way you've treated me suggests otherwise. When was the last time any of you called just to see how I was doing, not because you needed something or felt obligated? To check in? Derek and the kids were watching this exchange like spectators at a tennis match, their heads turning back and forth between the speakers. I felt bad for involving them in family drama, but I also thought they deserved to see how adults could address problems directly instead of letting resentment build for years. We call you all the time, David protested. You call me on schedule. Marcus every other Sunday, Jennifer once a week, David when he remembers. Dutiful calls that feel more like items being checked off a to-do list than genuine interest in my life. I pulled out another document from the folder, this one showing my monthly dividend payments. Do you know that some months I earn more in investment income than most people in this town make in salary? Do you know that the car you were so concerned about represents less than 5% of my liquid assets? Marcus was staring at the dividend statement like it was written in hieroglyphics. Mom, if this is all true, why have you been living like you don't have money? Why the coupons and the old car and the constant worry about expenses? Because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought I had nothing to offer you except problems and obligations. I wanted to know if your love was conditional on my neediness. The words hit the room like physical blows. I could see the pain and confusion on their faces, the dawning realization that their mother had been testing them for years, and they'd apparently failed the test. So this was all some kind of experiment? Jennifer asked, tears starting to form in her eyes. You've been playing games with us? I've been protecting myself, I said firmly. I've been making sure that when you paid attention to me, it was because you wanted to, not because you thought I might have something to leave you." Emma, who'd been absorbing this adult conversation with the intensity that only teenagers could muster, suddenly spoke up. "But Grandma, if you have all this money, why didn't you just tell us? Why make it a secret?" It was a fair question, and coming from my granddaughter, it hit harder than the defensive protests from her parents. Because, sweetheart, I've seen too many families torn apart by money. I've seen children who ignore their parents for years suddenly become very attentive when they learn about an inheritance. I wanted your parents to love me for who I am, not what I might give them. "But we do love you for who you are," Tyler said, speaking up for the first time. "At least, I think we do. I mean, I don't really think about money when I think about you. I think about how you always remember what books I'm reading and how you make the best chocolate chip cookies." His innocent honesty broke something open in my chest. These children, at least, saw me as a person rather than a problem to be managed or a resource to be protected. "Thank you, Tyler," I said softly. "That means more to me than you know." Marcus cleared his throat, bringing the conversation back to the practical matters that always seemed to dominate our family interactions. "Mom, I'm still trying to understand why you let us worry about your finances if you didn't need to. We've been concerned about whether you had enough money for retirement, whether you could afford medical care if you got sick." "And yet," I said, "when I actually needed help, like getting a ride to the Social Security office, none of you could be bothered to prioritize my needs over your schedules." The reminder of that day hit its mark. I could see the guilt flash across all three faces as they remembered leaving me stranded for hours because their convenience was more important than my necessity. "That was different," David said weakly. "That was just bad timing." "No," I said firmly. "That was a perfect example of how you see me, as someone whose needs are always less important than whatever else you have going on. As someone who should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention you can spare." Derek, who'd been mostly quiet during this family confrontation, finally spoke up. "Mrs. Miller, I think I understand what you're saying, but don't you think keeping this secret created some of the problems you're complaining about? If we'd known you were financially secure, we might have related to you differently." It was a thoughtful point, and I appreciated that he was trying to find middle ground. "You might have, Derek, but I needed to know who my children were when they thought I had nothing to offer them except the inconvenience of aging. And what I learned was that they saw me as someone who needed to be managed rather than someone who deserved to be respected." Jennifer was crying openly now, whether from guilt or frustration or simple overwhelm I couldn't tell. "So what happens now? Are you going to cut us out of your life? Disinherit us because we didn't pass your secret test?" I looked at her, this daughter I'd raised with such hopes and dreams, who'd grown into a woman so busy with her own life that she couldn't see her mother as a complete person. "I don't know yet, Jennifer. That depends on whether you can change how you see me and treat me going forward." Emma, ever the practical teenager, asked the question that was probably on everyone's mind. "Grandma, what do you want from us? Like, specifically?" I smiled at her directness. "I want to be treated like an adult who's capable of making her own decisions. I want my children to be interested in my life rather than just checking to make sure I'm not causing problems. I want to feel like I matter to you as a person, not just as a responsibility you inherited." "You do matter to us," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Do I? When was the last time any of you asked me about my interests, my hopes, my plans for the future? When was the last time you treated me like someone who might have wisdom to share, rather than someone who needed to be protected from her own poor judgment?" The questions hung in the air, unanswered because we all knew the answers. They'd relegated me to the role of aging parent who needed management rather than engagement, care rather than respect. Tyler, bless his 12-year-old heart, raised his hand again. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart." If you have all this money, are you going to do anything fun with it? Like travel or buy cool stuff? I laughed, delighted by his priorities. Actually, Tyler, I've been thinking about that a lot lately. I've been so focused on being careful and responsible that I forgot to enjoy the rewards of being successful. Like what kind of fun stuff? Well, I've always wanted to see Europe. Maybe take a cruise through the Mediterranean, visit museums in Paris, see the Northern Lights in Norway. Emma's eyes lit up. That sounds amazing. Are you going to go by yourself? I'm considering it. Or maybe I'll find some other adventurous women my age who want to travel together. The idea that their mother might have adventures without them, might build a social life that didn't revolve around their sporadic attention, seemed to catch my adult children off guard. They'd gotten so used to thinking of me as someone whose life was on hold, waiting for their visits and calls, that the possibility of me being proactive about my own happiness hadn't occurred to them. Mom, David said carefully, we don't want you to feel like you have to travel alone. Maybe we could plan some family trips, could we? I asked. When was the last time we took a family vacation? When was the last time all of you cleared your schedules for something that was important to me rather than just convenient for you? The silence that followed was answer enough. Family trips were things that happened around their availability, their budgets, their preferences. The idea of planning something around my interests and schedule was foreign to all of them. Derek spoke up again, and I was grateful for his outside perspective. Mrs. Miller, I think what you're describing is pretty common in families. Adult children get busy with their own lives and kind of put their parents on the back burner, especially when the parents seem to be doing fine on their own. But that's exactly the problem, I said. I've been doing fine on my own for years, but instead of that being something to celebrate, it became an excuse for them to pay less attention to me. My independence became their permission to care less. Emma, who'd been following this conversation, with the intensity of someone watching a really good TV drama, suddenly asked, "But Grandma, didn't you want them to care about you? Why didn't you just tell them you were lonely instead of testing them?" It was such a simple question, but it cut straight to the heart of everything. Why hadn't I just been honest about what I needed instead of creating elaborate tests they didn't know they were taking? Because, Emma, I shouldn't have to beg my children to love me. I shouldn't have to explain to them that I'm worth their time and attention. Those are things that should come naturally from people who claim to care about you. Marcus leaned forward in his chair. Mom, we do care about you. But you've always been so independent, so capable of handling everything yourself. We didn't think you needed us to worry about you. There's a difference between needing you to worry about me and wanting you to care about me, I said. I don't want to be your burden, but I also don't want to be invisible. Jennifer wiped her eyes with a tissue Derek handed her. I feel like we can't win. If we help too much, we're treating you like you're incompetent. If we don't help enough, we're neglecting you. If we call too often, we're being intrusive. If we don't call enough, we're ignoring you. She had a point, and I acknowledged it. You're right that it's a difficult balance, but the solution isn't to err on the side of neglect and then research legal ways to control my life when I make decisions you don't understand. Or the reminder of their intervention attempt brought the room back to the central issue that had prompted this meeting. They'd been so convinced of my incompetence that they'd consulted attorneys about taking away my legal autonomy. We really would never have gone through with that, David said. We were just scared and didn't know what else to do. Scared of what exactly? I asked. Scared that I might live my life differently than you expected? Scared that I might have capabilities you hadn't credited me with? Tyler, who'd been remarkably patient during this long adult conversation, suddenly stood up. Grandma, can we see your new car now? This is getting really heavy, and I want to see if it has a sunroof. I laughed, grateful for his ability to lighten the mood. Of course, sweetheart. Let's all go outside. We moved as a group to my driveway, where my Ford Explorer gleamed in the afternoon sun. Emma and Tyler immediately began exploring all the features, delighting in the heated seats and the backup camera and the premium sound system. "It really is a beautiful car," Jennifer admitted, running her hand along the smooth paint. "I just wish you'd told us you were thinking about buying something new." "Why?" I asked. "So you could talk me out of it? So you could explain why I didn't need it or couldn't afford it?" She didn't have an answer for that, because we both knew that's exactly what would have happened. They would have found reasons why a 71-year-old woman didn't need such an expensive vehicle, why I should stick with something more practical and economical. Marcus was examining the window sticker that was still in the glove compartment. $38,000, he said, shaking his head. "I still can't believe you paid that much in cash." "I can afford it," I said simply. "I can afford a lot of things. The question is whether I should start living like it." Emma looked up from the back seat, where she'd been testing all the controls. "I think you should, Grandma. I think you should buy whatever makes you happy and go wherever you want to go, even if it means I might not have as much money to leave you and your parents someday." She considered this seriously, which I appreciated. I think I'd rather have a grandma who's happy and having adventures than one who saves all her money for people who aren't even grateful for it. The honesty of children can be devastating in its clarity. Emma had summarized in one sentence what I'd been struggling to articulate for months. I'd rather be happy and appreciated than wealthy and taken for granted. As we stood around my new car in the late afternoon sun, I realized this conversation had changed something fundamental in our family dynamic. The secret was out. The facade was broken. The careful pretense of being the financially limited, emotionally grateful mother they expected me to be was shattered beyond repair. What came next would depend on whether they could adjust to seeing me as I really was, a successful, independent woman who deserved their respect rather than their management. A mother who had choices and resources and the ability to live life on her own terms. "I want you all to understand something," I said as we prepared to go back inside. "I love you. I always will. You're my children, and that bond is unbreakable. But the relationship we've had for the past few years isn't working for me anymore. I need you to see me as a whole person, not just as a responsibility or an obligation." "What does that look like practically?" Derek asked. "How do we change the dynamic?" I appreciated his willingness to engage with the problem constructively. "It looks like calling me because you want to talk to me, not because you feel like you should. It looks like being interested in my life and my plans instead of just checking to make sure I'm not causing problems. It looks like trusting my judgment, instead of assuming I need your approval for my decisions." Marcus nodded slowly. "And if we can't do that? If we keep falling back into old patterns?" I looked at him. This serious son who'd inherited his father's responsible nature but seemed to have lost touch with his capacity for joy and spontaneity. "Then I'll build a life that doesn't depend on your approval or attention. I'll travel the world, make new friends, create new experiences. I'll make sure my money goes to people and causes that appreciate it instead of taking it for granted." The threat was implicit but clear. They could choose to have a relationship with the real me, or they could continue relating to their diminished version of me and discover that she was no longer available. They could adapt to my independence and success, or they could lose access to both me and the financial security they'd apparently been counting on without realizing it. As we walked back toward the house, Emma slipped her hand into mine. "Grandma?" "Yes, sweetheart? I'm glad you told us the truth, even if it's complicated. I like knowing who you really are." And in that moment, I knew that regardless of what happened with my adult children, I'd done the right thing. The truth was complicated, but it was also liberating. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again. 6 months after that confrontational family meeting, I was sipping champagne in a first-class cabin 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, watching the sunrise paint the clouds in shades of gold and rose. My destination was Barcelona, the first stop on a 3-week Mediterranean cruise I'd booked entirely for myself, without consulting anyone about the timing, the cost, or the wisdom of a 72-year-old woman traveling alone. The woman in the seat next to me, a retired professor named Gloria from Portland, was equally excited about the adventure ahead. We'd struck up a conversation during boarding and discovered we were both traveling solo for the first time in decades, both recently liberated from family expectations that had kept us living smaller lives than we'd wanted. "My daughter thinks I've lost my mind," Gloria confided as we clinked glasses. "She can't understand why I'd want to travel without my late husband's itinerary and preferences dictating every decision." I smiled, thinking about my own children's reactions when I'd announced my travel plans. Mine staged an intervention because they thought I was mentally declining. Turns out they just couldn't imagine I might be mentally expanding. The months following our family confrontation had been a period of profound change for all of us. Some of the changes had been painful, some liberating, but all of them had been necessary. The carefully constructed facade of our family relationships had crumbled, revealing truths that none of us had been prepared to face. Marcus had been the first to reach out after our meeting, calling me 3 days later with what sounded like a rehearsed speech about wanting to rebuild our relationship on more honest ground. But old habits died hard, and within minutes, he was back to his usual pattern of checking items off his mental list of parental responsibilities. "So, Mom, about this cruise you mentioned, have you researched the safety protocols? What about travel insurance? Do you have emergency contacts established in case something happens while you're overseas?" I'd listened patiently to his concerns, recognizing them as his way of showing care, but I'd also been firm about my boundaries. "Marcus, I've been planning this trip for 2 months. I've handled every detail myself, and I'm perfectly capable of managing any situations that arise." "I know you are, but wouldn't you feel more comfortable having someone stateside who knows your itinerary and can help coordinate things if needed?" The offer was reasonable, but the underlying assumption was still that I needed oversight and management. "I appreciate the concern," I'd said, "but I'm not looking for a safety net. I'm looking for an adventure." Jennifer's response had been more emotional and, in some ways, more honest. She'd called me crying, apologizing for years of taking me for granted and begging me not to shut them out of my life. But even her apologies had been filtered through her own needs and fears. "I just can't stand the thought of you being angry with us," she'd sobbed. "We're family, and family is supposed to forgive each other and stick together no matter what. Family is also supposed to respect each other," I'd replied gently. "And respect means seeing each other clearly, not just through the lens of what's convenient or comfortable." The conversation had lasted for over an hour, with Jennifer cycling through guilt, anger, bargaining, and eventual acceptance. By the end, she'd agreed to work on seeing me as an individual rather than just as her mother, though I could tell the concept still felt foreign to her. David had been the most resistant to change, perhaps because his life in Kansas City had insulated him from the day-to-day realities of my existence. When I'd told him about my cruise plans, he'd actually laughed. "Mom, you've never been on a cruise in your life. You've never even been to Europe. Don't you think you should start with something smaller, like a long weekend in Chicago?" His condescension had been so complete and so unconscious that I'd actually felt sorry for him. "David, I've been dreaming about Europe since I was younger than you are now. The only reason I haven't gone is that I was too busy raising children and building a life for other people. But what if you don't like it? What if you get seasick or homesick or can't handle the foreign languages and customs? Then I'll deal with those challenges as they arise," I'd said. "The same way I've dealt with every other challenge in my 72 years. The preparations for my trip had been a revelation in themselves. I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed research and planning, how satisfying it was to make decisions based entirely on my own preferences and interests. I'd studied maps of the Mediterranean, read guidebooks about ancient ruins and modern cities, learned basic phrases in Spanish and Italian and Greek. I'd also done something I'd never done before. I'd shopped for clothes that made me feel beautiful rather than just presentable. Flowing dresses in jewel tones, comfortable but elegant shoes, a wide-brimmed hat that made me feel like a character in a romantic movie. I'd bought a new set of luggage, lightweight but luxurious, and filled it with everything I might need for an adventure. The night before my departure, I'd had dinner with Emma and Tyler, who'd been my most enthusiastic supporters throughout this whole process. Emma had helped me download translation apps and showed me how to use my phone's camera to navigate foreign cities. Tyler had made me promise to send him pictures of everything I ate, especially the desserts. "Grandma," Emma had said as we said goodbye, "I think what you're doing is really brave. I hope when I'm your age, I'll have the courage to do whatever makes me happy." "You don't have to wait until you're my age," I told her. "Courage is something you can practice at any age." Now, settling into my cruise ship cabin with its private balcony overlooking the Mediterranean, I felt the profound satisfaction of a promise kept to myself. This wasn't just a vacation, it was proof that I could build a life that reflected my actual desires rather than other people's expectations. My cabin was beautiful, with a king-sized bed, a sitting area with a view of the ocean, and a marble bathroom that was larger than my kitchen back home. I'd splurged on the suite because I could afford it and because I wanted to experience luxury without apologizing for it. The other passengers were a mix of couples and solo travelers, ranging in age from their 40s to their 80s. At the welcome cocktail party, I met a retired diplomat named Robert who'd been widowed for 5 years and was taking his first solo cruise. There was also a group of 4 women from Australia who'd been traveling together annually for a decade, celebrating their friendship and their freedom. "The thing about traveling alone," explained Margaret, the unofficial leader of the Australian group, "is that you discover you're much more capable than you thought you were. You also discover that the world is full of interesting people who are happy to share their stories with a curious stranger." Over the next 3 weeks, I discovered the truth in her words. I wandered through the narrow streets of Barcelona, marveling at Gaudi's architectural fantasies. I stood in the Colosseum in Rome, feeling the weight of history beneath my feet. I watched the sunset from the cliffs of Santorini, understanding why people had been writing poetry about Greek islands for thousands of years. But more than the sights and experiences, I discovered something about myself that I'd almost forgotten. I was good company for myself. I enjoyed my own thoughts and observations. I could spend hours reading on my balcony without feeling lonely or bored. I could strike up conversations with strangers without feeling anxious or self-conscious. In Florence, I met a woman named Catherine who was traveling with her elderly mother. Catherine was probably Jennifer's age, and she spent most of her time managing her mother's needs, translating for her, making sure she didn't get tired or overwhelmed. "It's wonderful that you're traveling together," I said during a conversation at a cafe near the Uffizi. Catherine smiled, but it looked tired. Mom's always wanted to see Italy, and I knew if I didn't take her now, she might never get the chance. But honestly, it's exhausting being responsible for someone else's happiness and safety every minute of the day. I thought about my own children, who'd spent years assuming I needed that kind of management and oversight. What would happen if you just let her manage her own experience? "Oh, she can't do that," Catherine said quickly. "She gets confused in foreign places, and her Italian is terrible. She needs someone to take care of the details." Looking across, the table at Catherine's mother, who was studying her guidebook with intense concentration and occasionally asking passers-by for directions in her broken but enthusiastic Italian, I wondered if Catherine was protecting her mother from challenges or from growth. "Has she always been dependent on you for travel?" I asked. "Not always, but as she's gotten older, she's become more anxious about new situations. It's easier if I just handle everything." I recognized the dynamic immediately. Catherine had fallen into the same trap my children had, assuming that caring for someone meant controlling their experiences and protecting them from difficulties. But protection and control often looked identical from the outside, and both could be equally limiting. That evening, I called Jennifer from my cabin as the ship sailed toward our next port. It was early morning in Kansas, and she answered on the first ring. "Mom, how's the cruise? Are you having a good time? Are you safe? Have you made friends?" I laughed at the rapid-fire questions. "I'm having a wonderful time, and yes, I'm perfectly safe. I've met some lovely people and seen incredible sights. I've been worried about you traveling alone. Are you sure you're not lonely?" "I'm not lonely at all," I said, and realized it was completely true. I'm enjoying my own company more than I have in years. There was a pause, and I could hear her processing this information. That's good, I guess. I just can't imagine traveling without Derek and the kids. It would feel so strange not having anyone to share experiences with. "I'm sharing them," I said, "with myself, with the people I meet, with you right now as I tell you about them. There are many ways to share joy, Jennifer." When I hung up, I realized that our conversation had felt different from our usual exchanges. Jennifer had asked questions because she was genuinely interested in my answers, not because she was checking items off a list of parental concerns. It was a small shift, but it felt significant. The second week of the cruise brought us to the Greek islands, where the light was so brilliant and the water so impossibly blue that I understood why ancient peoples had believed the gods lived in these places. I spent a morning in a pottery studio on Mykonos, learning to throw clay on a wheel from an artist who spoke no English, but communicated perfectly through gestures and laughter. In the afternoon, I sat in a taverna overlooking the harbor, writing postcards to my grandchildren and thinking about the life I'd built for myself over the past months. I'd joined a book club that actually discussed books instead of just gossiping about town politics. I'd started taking art classes at the community college. I'd begun volunteering at a literacy center, helping adults learn to read. But most importantly, I'd stopped waiting for other people to make my life meaningful. I'd started creating meaning for myself. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Hope you're having fun but being careful. David mentioned you've been posting pictures on Facebook. Maybe don't advertise that you're traveling alone?" I sighed, recognizing the familiar pattern of his concern mixed with condescension. But instead of getting irritated, I felt something closer to pity. Marcus was 45 years old and still couldn't imagine his mother as capable of managing her own safety and security. I typed back, "Thank you for the concern. I'm being appropriately cautious while still enjoying my freedom. See you when I get back." It was a measured response, acknowledging his care while maintaining my boundaries. I was learning that I could love my children without needing their approval or understanding. I could appreciate their concern without being limited by their fears. The final week of the cruise was the most revelatory. We'd reached the point where many of the passengers had become familiar faces, and I'd settled into a routine that felt completely natural. Morning coffee on my balcony, afternoon excursions to explore whatever port we'd reached, evening conversations with fellow travelers in the ship's various lounges and restaurants. I'd also made a decision that surprised even me. I'd started planning my next trip before this one was even over. The cruise had been so fulfilling that I wanted to continue exploring, continue challenging myself, continue discovering what other experiences had been waiting for me all these years. On the last night of the cruise, Robert, the retired diplomat I'd met on the first evening, invited me to have dinner at the ship's specialty restaurant. We'd become friends over the course of the voyage, sharing stories about our late spouses, our children, our careers, and our hopes for whatever adventures lay ahead. "I have to admit," he said over dessert, "when I first decided to take this cruise alone, I was terrified. I thought I'd be miserable and lonely and probably seasick the entire time. And instead, I've had one of the best experiences of my life. I've remembered who I am when I'm not defined by other people's needs and expectations. I raised my glass of wine in a toast to discovering that we're much more interesting than we thought we were, and to the courage to act on that discovery, he added. When we docked in Barcelona for disembarkation, I felt a mixture of sadness that the adventure was ending and excitement for whatever came next. I'd proven to myself that I could navigate foreign countries, handle unexpected situations, and create meaningful connections with strangers. But more than that, I'd proven that I could be happy entirely on my own terms. The flight home gave me time to reflect on how much had changed since I'd left Kansas 3 weeks earlier. I was returning as a different person, someone who'd remembered her own capacity for joy and discovery. I was returning with stories to tell, plans to make, and a clear sense of my own worth that didn't depend on other people's approval. Marcus picked me up at the airport, and I could see him studying my face as I walked through the terminal. I probably looked different, tanned and relaxed and confident in a way I hadn't been in years. "You look good, Mom," he said, giving me a hug that felt more genuine than our usual greetings. "The trip obviously agreed with you." "It was exactly what I needed," I said, and meant it. During the drive home, he asked thoughtful questions about my experiences, and I found myself sharing stories about the places I'd visited and the people I'd met. He listened without offering advice or expressing concerns about my safety or judgment, which felt like a small miracle. "I have to admit," he said as we pulled into my driveway, "I was worried about you being alone for so long. But you seem more like yourself than you have in years." "I am more like myself," I said. I'd forgotten who that person was. Over the following weeks, I settled back into my routines in Millfield, but they were different routines now. I'd rearranged my house to display some of the art and crafts I'd purchased during my travels. I'd started cooking recipes I'd learned from fellow passengers. I'd begun planning my next adventure, this time a river cruise through Germany and Austria. Most importantly, my relationships with my children had continued to evolve. Jennifer had started calling me to ask about my experiences rather than just to check on my welfare. David had actually asked for my advice about a work situation, treating me like someone who might have valuable insights to share. Marcus had invited me to have dinner with his family, not out of duty, but because he wanted to hear more about my travels. Emma and Tyler had become my most enthusiastic supporters, begging for details about every aspect of my trip, and already planning their own future adventures. Emma had announced that she wanted to study abroad in college, inspired by her grandmother's courage to explore the world. "You've changed something in our family," she told me during one of our weekly coffee dates. "You've shown us that getting older doesn't mean getting smaller." 6 months after returning from my cruise, I was sitting in my backyard garden, which I'd finally replanted with flowers and herbs that pleased me rather than just whatever was practical. I was reading a book about Tuscany and planning my next European adventure when my phone rang. It was Patricia Henley, my financial advisor, calling with the quarterly report on my investments. The numbers were even better than I'd expected, reflecting both good market performance and my decision to finally start spending some of my wealth instead of just accumulating it. "Mrs. Miller," she said, "I have to say, you're one of our most successful clients, not just financially, but in terms of actually enjoying the rewards of your smart planning. Most people your age are too afraid to spend money on experiences. I spent too many years being afraid of my own success," I said. "I'm making up for lost time." After we hung up, I sat in the afternoon sun, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. I'd spent decades building wealth, in secret, testing my children's love and living smaller than I needed to. But I'd also learned that it's never too late to change course, never too late to start living authentically, never too late to demand the respect and consideration you deserve. My children had needed to see me as I really was, not as their limited version of who I should be. They'd needed to understand that I was a complete person with my own dreams, capabilities, and resources. Some of that understanding had come easily, and some had required difficult conversations and painful truths. But the result was a family that was more honest, more respectful, and more genuinely connected than we'd been in years. My children saw me now as someone who could offer wisdom and experience rather than just someone who needed care and management. They'd learned to appreciate my independence rather than being threatened by it. And I'd learned that the most important relationship I could cultivate was the one with myself. I'd remembered that I was interesting, capable, and deserving of joy. I'd stopped waiting for other people to make my life meaningful and started creating meaning for myself. As the sun set over my garden, I opened my laptop and began researching cooking classes in Tuscany. At 72, I was just getting started. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.